Welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. Today we're talking about part 2 with our good friend and senior legal counsel with First Liberty Institute, Jeremy Dys. We're going to take a hard look at the legal landscape in America, and we're going to talk about specific ways that doors have been opened for you to continue to exercise your religious faith in America. It's time to operate with some courage and to take our faith to the public square. Here we go, part 2. You know, I think to myself, like, first of all, our government should not be actively working against its own citizens. And I feel like we are in a new era of government overreach. Now, we've heard about government overreach before, but this is, in my opinion, it's outrageous. The government, number one, is unable to help all those who are in need in this community, right? They can't house everybody. They can't give food to everybody that needs it. They can't give them the guidance that they need to get off of the streets. And here's an organization that says, hey, we're going to do it. We're going to step into the gap, which is, by the way American society is made to be. Government's not designed to meet all of our needs. In fact, it's the local community that's designed to do that. And in particular, from my perspective, the faith community. This Dad's Place is actually operating as the hands and feet of Jesus, exactly what you would expect the church to do. In fact, I think we should meet less on Sunday and more, well, not really, but more activity like this. You know, the church needs to go into the community and meet needs like this. And the government continues to criminalize them.
Yeah, well, let's just assume that the city of Bryan could meet every physical need of every person in their community. I know that's fanciful and they couldn't. But let's just assume that they could. They could provide housing, even though there's a massive housing crisis in that area. Jeez. But they could provide somehow housing. They could provide food. They could provide medical services. They could care for the body and the physical person of every individual in Bryan, Ohio.
Yes.
Well, they still can't care for the soul.
Yes.
And that's really where Dad's Place and so many other churches around the country and other houses of worship come into the picture. Because government may be a good resource when it comes to caring for physical needs. I know we can have a debate on that point. Let's just assume that they can.
Yep.
But they're really bad at caring for the soul. But that's what Pastor Avell does so very, very well. And so many other pastors and rabbis and priests around the country do the very same thing. This is why the First Amendment and federal law protects religious institutions, houses of worship all over the country, in their use of their property for what the government might consider silly, stupid, and dumb purposes, but in reality are critical to the overwhelming soul of every individual creature on this planet.
Yes.
And so that's why we work so diligently to make sure that they've got the freedom to do what government cannot.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, let's first of all, I'm very encouraged by that. And I hope there's two things that come of this. One is that our audience is encouraged, but two is that they encourage their pastors to figure out a way to meet some needs in their communities, physical needs, of course, but also to go and meet these spiritual needs as well. So I think there's a lot of takeaways from that. Let's talk a little bit about Rabbi Levi Gerlitsky. This is a case that really, if you know anything about what's happening internationally, about the persecution of home churches, if you will, the local church in China, for example, is in homes. It's underground. And that's true in most of the communist world, of course, most of these countries that are dictatorships. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in America with Rabbi Levi.
Yeah, Rabbi Gerlitsky lives in Hawaii on the Big Island there and started something called the Chabad of the Big Island. It's a Jewish center there in Hawaii. And he uses his home for religious gatherings, whether that's minyans, so prayer meetings early in the morning with 10 or more men, or perhaps it's Shabbat services on Friday evenings into Saturdays, Shabbat meals on Sunday. For bigger gatherings during the high holidays, he rents out a place, but that provides its own difficulty because in order to make those places kosher, it's a pretty expensive and lengthy process. So it's hard to do that on the regular. But his home is perfectly fine for those meetings because it's already kosher, and they can go ahead and have their regular small meetings that they have there. And really, we're talking about small, like, less than the people you probably had in your home for the Super Bowl party this past Super Bowl, right? And so, but the county there in Hawaii doesn't like this. And I don't know if they receive complaints from the community or whatever. I don't know. It doesn't matter. They've come after Rabbi Gerlitsky. We've tried 2 or 3 different times to talk with the county to no avail.
Hmm.
And so they continued to penalize him with daily fines for not having compliance with their local zoning rules. The fines have now mounted up to over $40,000
Oh my
on this little
gosh.
rabbi in Hawaii. Why? Because he's using his home for religious purposes for these religious gatherings. Never mind the fact that there are luau's down the street, there
Right.
are card games down the street, there are Super Bowl parties that are far bigger than what he's hosting in his home. This is America, where
Yeah.
we have been meeting in our homes for religious purposes. Well, I mean, go back to the Pilgrims, and that's what they were doing,
Yes.
for Pete's sake, until they had
Yeah.
the meeting house. So we've been doing this for a long time, and yet the county of Hawaii is intent on going after this rabbi for doing the very thing that, according to our entire history as a country, has been perfectly in keeping
Mm.
with our history and tradition. So we have had to file a lawsuit against the county of Hawaii. In next month, I'll be flying out to Hawaii for a hearing out there if they
Wow.
don't settle things before then, to make sure that we get an injunction to protect his right to be able to worship in his own home, to use his house. This comes in to
Amazing.
be even more important than for many other religions, because in the Orthodox Jewish faith, they can't operate a vehicle on their Sabbath. And so they have to be within walking distance to their place of worship.
Wow.
And so that really narrows down the options for a lot of people, especially in Hawaii, to be
Mm.
able to meet their religious obligations. Look, in this country, we ought to be rewarding people like like Rabbi Gerlitsky
Yes.
for using a creative means to care for the souls of those around him,
Yes.
rather than punishing them with stifling fines that would run them out of business right there
Yes.
in Hawaii.
And this is what the government does. Like, not just on this particular freedom, religious freedom, but they charge you, they penalize you, they put these fines on people that there's no way they can pay these fines, and then they end up having to cease and desist, if you will. So they end up penalizing them, and we've seen this in almost every aspect of freedom, where the government imposes taxes or fines or fees that make it impossible for everyday Americans to exercise their rights and their freedoms. I was thinking, my wife and I operated community groups, house churches, if you will, affiliated with our churches for 30 years in the state of Maryland. That would have been, if this was the case, if someone complained and the government went after us, we would have had the same type of situation happening, just for having other couples to talk about issues of faith in our home.
Well, we recently filed a lawsuit in New Hampshire on a very similar point, where we have a pastor planting a church in a little town called Ware, New Hampshire. And for that church plant, he uses a renovated barn on his property. It's the largest room in his house. He holds meetings in his
Uh-huh.
study to do some counseling. He does some smaller meetings in his kitchen. But for the larger 25 to 30 person church gathering, he hosted in his barn. Well, the town of Ware has come after him for that. Never mind
Wow.
the fact that he actually has used that openly for many years to hold political gatherings, to hold weddings, birthday parties, all kinds of things. No problem. But you use it as a church, now we've got issues. Well,
Wow.
the reason I raised that is I chuckled at it, because in talking with the pastor right before we filed this lawsuit a couple weeks ago, it was right the week before the Super Bowl, and he had an inspector in there doing something about a heater, and the inspector looked at the pews that were set up in there. He's got these sort of antiquated pews that are set
Hmm.
up, and he says, "You know what? I have a pew just like that in my garage. In fact, I'm going to be having that whole garage filled with a bunch of people sitting on that pew for the Super Bowl this coming Sunday." And our pastor sort of got a twinkle in his eye, looked at him and said, "Well, did you get a permit for that?"
Yeah.
And the inspector, whose job it is to require permits of people, apparently, said,
Gosh.
"Well, no, I didn't even think about that." Well, you think? I mean, the double standard is very obvious here, where they're going to welcome you to have Super Bowl parties,
Of
book
course.
clubs, and anything like that. Sure, you can read the latest book with a group of people that Oprah recommends, but if you sit
Right.
down and study First Timothy with a bunch of people in a big room, you got to go ask Mother May I from the government. Well,
Gosh.
that's not how we have founded our country.
Mm.
Instead, the government and federal law, and sorry, the Constitution and federal law supports the notion that you can actually use your property for religious purposes free from government interference. And if anybody tells you
Amazing.
otherwise, go to firstliberty.org and let us know.
Yes. It's amazing. And this isn't going away. Like, I think over the last 3 years of really diving into the government's active stance against people of faith. It's not only this; it's around Roe v. Wade. It's around it's in 100 different ways where people of faith are being targeted. I think we're going to see more of this. The fact that all of these lawsuits keep coming can be discouraging. I mean, the more the more discouraging it can be, because you think, didn't we already win this? And then you go, yeah, we did already win this. And why are we fighting this again? But that's, again, why we need to get the word out on these things so that people can continue to exercise their rights. Let's shift gears just a little bit. Let's talk about his Tabernacle Family Church, where people were having to sacrifice one constitutionally protected right to exercise another. Tell us a little bit about that case.
Yeah, Pastor Spencer and I first got acquainted with one another during COVID, where the county up in New York was requiring mask mandates and preventing religious gatherings of a certain size, and we pushed back on his behalf there. And then a couple years, and we were successful, by the way, but a couple years later, the state of New York changes its laws. Why? Well, they changed their laws when it came to gun laws after a very prominent Second Amendment case was handed down by the Supreme Court. That case is called Bruin. The Bruin case it said that basically when the government says, or when the Constitution says you cannot abridge the right to carry weapons, to bear arms, it actually means what it says. And so the state of New York's policies were woefully unconstitutional. 8 days later, the state of New York passes a new round of legislation meant to challenge the new opinion. And in that situation, they said, look, if you're a business, you can choose whether or not people get to carry a weapon on your business property. But if you are a house of worship, we've made that decision for you. You cannot do it.
Wow.
And our pastor said, well, this is going to be a problem because I've had people come to my own home threatening to kill me. And the state police, in fact, recommended that I get my license to carry. And I've had that for many, many years, decades, as a matter of fact. And while I may not carry on Sunday mornings in the pulpit, I want to be able to recognize that people within my church have the freedom to do so if they so wish. I take shepherding and guarding my flock very, very, very seriously.
Wow.
But the state has already made that decision. So we pushed back on that. And here was kind of a novel argument. We said, number one, he's got the free exercise rights, that part of the Constitution that says you can exercise your faith, that he can do this if he wishes to. But we also said the Establishment Clause prevents the government from making that decision for the church. And because we made both of those arguments, there were a whole bunch of lawsuits that were filed to challenge this, mostly on Second Amendment grounds. A bunch of lawsuits filed. But we were the only ones that made the First Amendment argument on that point.
Wow.
All the Second Amendment cases lost. But our case won because we made that First Amendment argument, which is just a good reminder to all of us that these freedoms go in order. The first freedom, religious freedom, is a core foundational freedom that if it goes out of the way, all the other ones begin to topple along with it all. So it's important for us to be able to litigate these issues, that we put out those important issues in order. Yes, we're happy to wield the Second Amendment when we have to, but we also recognize that there's a First Amendment argument here to be made. And in this situation, we were very, very successful in making that argument.
It's amazing. And, this with the censorship and with the cancel culture and the silencing, I mean, this is actively happening. I've experienced it. You may have. This is a big one. The First Amendment is a pretty important amendment that we've got to defend. But I love the way the Second Amendment defense didn't work, but the First Amendment, it's fascinating to me how creative you have to be to defend our freedoms. And that's why we're so thankful for it. And, I think in terms of, other aspects of culture which are coming under fire. Let's talk a little bit about Minnesota moms. That the First Amendment protects the rights of parents. Now, this is, wow, I never thought in my lifetime we'd have to get legal protection for a parent making the decisions for their children's education and all aspects of their well-being. But we have to make that case today, don't we?
Yeah, it's very disappointing. And here you have moms that are Muslim immigrants to this country in the state of Minnesota. And you kind of know the story already. The Minnesota schools decided to have books as required reading in their classrooms. I don't need to tell you what was in those books. And in fact, I don't want to tell you what's in those books because I think you'd probably get censored if I did. But those were the things that they were going to be forcing down the elementary students of these parents. And the parents were asking for something very, very simple. Give us notice. let us opt out of this.
Yes.
And the school system was adamant against that. They would not allow that to be the case. They were going to require these students to go through this program over the objections of their parents. And if they didn't like it, they could leave. Well,
Yep.
wow, is that un-American? And so we simply pushed back on that and said, guys, federal law, the Constitution requires that you respect the religious beliefs of parents like this. Federal law requires you to give them an opt-out if they request it, and you have to do that. And so we began to push back pretty strongly on that point, and eventually the school district realized that they're going to be in a world of hurt if they didn't succumb to this idea that the law promotes. And so they backed off of that for now. Look, this is a very simple thing. We didn't have to file a lawsuit in that case. We were preparing to do so. We wanted to do so, quite frankly. But because some very humble moms decided we're not going to stand for this,
Yes.
they did it in a very humble way, but they pushed back and said, no, you cannot tell our children what to believe. That's our job to make that decision. Give us something alternative to this. Let us go into another room and read over there. We don't mind if our kids are sort of ostracized from the rest of the crowd, because we think that's more important for them to be holy or whatever they want to describe it as, rather than being indoctrinated in the mainstream of your school. Isn't that just what we do as a country, as allow people to have different beliefs? And yet the school district was unwilling to bend to that without lawyers getting involved. So praise the Lord that it actually resulted in a good victory here. But goodness sakes, why did the lawyers even have to get involved in a case like this? This should have been something that would have been easily solved at the local level. But goodness, I'm so glad these moms recognizing, come to this country, the importance of freedom, that they have these freedoms here in this country. That's what they came to this country for. And yet they were being denied it too.
And now they're seeing the same circumstances that they experienced with no freedom in their home country. They're experiencing those same things happening here. And, most foreign-born citizens who are citizens of the United States now are very, very concerned about the trends that they're seeing in this country, about the abridgment of these freedoms. And, it's interesting. We need you to come to Colorado on the school thing. The schools in Colorado, it's a disaster, an absolute disaster. They are, this whole opt-out clause, they're hostile to parents in board meetings. It's amazing. And, it's funny because I know that with the Minnesota moms, they were like, wow, first of all, they're super thankful, right, for First Liberty, because they believe, like we believe, that they have a sacred obligation to teach principles of faith to their children without being undermined by their schools. I believe that we should have to opt into this nonsense. I believe they should have to tell us what they want to teach our kids. And if we want to allow our kids to be taught this nonsense, we have to opt in. Otherwise, we're all out of it. That would be a much simpler, in my opinion, a much simpler solution to this thing. Hey, let us make us opt in. Forget about this opt-out clause.
That seems to make sense to me entirely, or at least give us the opportunity to take our kids elsewhere or teach them at home or whatever it might be, and respect those decisions along the way. But look, if we're going to have these public schools, they have to be able to respect the differences of beliefs. Look, I happen to not share the theology that our clients share, and that's okay. That's perfectly fine. They're welcome to believe what they believe, so long as I get to believe what I believe as well. And there doesn't need to be a conflict between those two things. There can just simply be a peaceful disagreement between them.
That's right.
In history, we've settled those differences very badly, and usually in a very bloody way. This country is unique in world history because we've settled those differences peacefully and civilly. And so it's very good for us as the melting pot that we are of the world, to have these differences over here, so that we would all become one American people, e pluribus unum, out of many one, that we would respect this idea of freedom. And that would be a tremendous thing.
Thank God we're a constitutional republic and not a mobocracy. A constitutional republic means that right makes might. That ultimately the right ideas, the ideas that benefit human flourishing and freedom, will ultimately win. Mobocracy means simply, if you have a majority, man, you can impose your will on anybody. Might makes right. And we've got to reject this idea that anything's a threat to democracy. We're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic with documents that guide our behavior. And I think once that's why I love what you're doing, because you're in constitutional law. This is all about the Constitution.
Yeah, and if we didn't have that written down document, we would be in a world of hurt. And that's why I sort of
That's
chuckle at what you just said sometimes, because guys, it's not that hard to figure out. I went to 3 years of law school, and maybe I get to charge a premium for interpreting what the Constitution says, but it was written so that you would be able to understand what your rights actually are. It's
yes,
pretty easy to figure out. Now,
yes,
I can find out some more, areas of the law that have been interpreted here and there, and interpret federal law a little bit more easily. That's why we get to do what we are as lawyers. But
yeah,
you can read the Constitution just like I can, and it's pretty simple to understand when we look into it.
yes. Let me ask you this, because this really is all about a changing culture. I think the fact that our government is so litigious against American citizens and our freedoms is a sign of the cultural erosion, right? We have somehow allowed people to get elected into positions or appointed into positions in local, city, county, state governments, all the way to the federal level, of course, that do not share a love for the Constitution and what we're founded on. How do we, from your seat, because you see it all the way to the Supreme Court, how do we start to win that fight, win that war at the local levels so that we can stop this nonsense litigation?
Well, look, that's a little bit outside of what I do, but
Yeah,
I can tell you from my perspective, we've gone out and won the victories that we need you to then exercise. This is part of
yeah,
what I meant at the beginning of getting into the
yes,
gym and strengthening that freedom muscle once more. Uh, you know, I keep thinking of Joe Kennedy again. I know you and
yes,
I have been together on the program with Joe, and I
yes,
love Joe. He's a great guy, but he's not some sort of savant. He's not the most intelligent professor that is out there, right? He'd be the
yeah,
first one to tell you that. He's a smart guy, but
yes,
he's not the most. He's not high on the IQ scale like Steve Hawking or whatever it might be.
right,
He's a great guy and a very smart
yes,
person. In other words, it doesn't take much for you to
no,
preserve freedom.
yeah,
You can actually just take a knee on a football field and preserve
yes,
freedom. Um, these school board elections are won by
yes,
Sunday school class sizes, right? They're pretty
yes,
easy to pretty small wins that are out there.
yes,
And you can go out and run for your school board and
mhm,
make your position the one that is you think should carry the day.
yes,
And so, look, go do it, right? Maybe you're called to run for Congress. I don't know.
yes,
Maybe you're just called to run for a school board, or maybe you can be just like my wife, my sisters, and the rest of our extended family, that we sit
no,
down at dinner time and talk about the ideas of freedom.
yes,
I tell this to my sisters all the time, that they do way more for the cause of freedom than I will ever do by just
mhm,
simply caring for their kids and telling them what freedom actually means. So you want to
yes,
make a difference? Have dinner with your kids tonight. Tell them
yes,
about what freedom means, and tell them what that means for them in the future. That's what Ronald Reagan reminded us, is that freedom
yes,
is not something that passes down through the bloodstream. We have to
mhm,
recommit ourselves to it every generation and tell them about it, lest we wake up one day and talk about the
yes,
America that used to be.
yes,
That is my goal, to prevent that from ever becoming a forgotten moment in our history. Instead, I want
yes,
to make generations of freedom loving Americans that will go
yes,
and perpetuate the greatest idea of freedom on this planet, short of
yes,
eternity in heaven.
mm,
To be able to, what did the founders say? That we've got a
yeah,
republic that is the very worst form of government, except for all the others of them,
yeah,
right? This is the
exactly,
best form that we have as humans to be able to make sure that we can
yes,
maximize the freedom we have in this country. That falls not to the government, that falls
yes,
to you and me as individuals. So, whatever it is in
mm,
your world, maybe it's taking a knee on a football field, perhaps it's running for
mm,
Congress, maybe it's just simply having dinner and dessert with your kids and tell them about what freedom actually means. Whatever
yeah.
it is, go do that thing to preserve our freedom.
Yes. Well, I think that's a great way to punctuate our time together. Super grateful for you walking us through all of the legal precedent that has been toppled, all of the building blocks for freedom that you have established, all the doors we've kicked in to maintain it so we can get back in the gym and exercise our freedoms. Jeremy, thank you so much. I really appreciate our time. This is going to be a massive encouragement to our listeners, and I think it's going to empower them to actually take action. Thanks again, my friend.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You're the best.